Chapter 7 of From Slave Cabin to Pulpit by Peter Randolph. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, Religious Condition. In the previous chapter I spoke more directly concerning the political and social environments of the colored people in Richmond, as I found them at the close of the war. In this chapter I wish to speak more definitely concerning their religious condition. I arrived in Richmond 25 days after the surrender, and was there only 2 weeks when I was invited to assume the pastorate of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. I accepted the same for 3 months' trial, and at the expiration of that time was duly called as the regular pastor. This was at the beginning of an important era in the religious history of the colored people. This church, as well as others through the South, had never had a colored pastor. He who was considered the under-shepherd and was expected to lead his flock into the green pastures and beside the still waters was always white. Why the colored people should now change their old pastors for new ones may be more easily imagined than described. But this must be said, that the colored people as a whole had but little confidence and faith in their white pastors as religious leaders. They rather looked upon them as parts of the machinery that belonged to slavery, and regarded them more as religious bosses, whose duty it was to keep them in their places by persuading them to be contented with their present lot and obey their masters in the flesh, for such was well-pleasing to God. Now they were free and had a voice in selecting their pastor. It is not unreasonable to suppose that they wanted a pastor who could sympathize with them in their afflictions and remember the bondman as bound with him. They wanted one who could preach without fear, not only on obedience, but on love, the fatherhood of God, and the brotherhood of man, and how Christ came to deliver the captive and set the bondman free. On such topics as the foregoing, the white pastor always had to touch lightly for fear of losing his official head. In this new state of affairs, naturally new difficulties arose. There were no colored preachers educated and trained in the South for this important trust and responsibility. Whatever qualifications I had for the pastorate, and my ideas of the church polity, had all been received in the North and not from the South. I was brought immediately face to face with strange customs and trying difficulties. I found that the male and female members of the church were not allowed to sit together on the same side of the church. When the husband and wife entered the vestibule of the church, they separated, the husband going in at one door to his side of the house, and the wife going in at another door to her side of the house. Likewise, the mother and son, the bridal couple, the lover and the loved, all had to conform to this rule. I condemned and ridiculed such a custom as a relic of slavery, and soon had the family sitting together, and the young men with the young ladies whom they accompanied to church. This was a new state of things, and soon my church was named the Aristocratic Church. The women were allowed no part in the church meetings. I tried to show that the women bore the greater part of the burden and expenses of the church, and as members they were entitled to recognition. Before I left the church, the women not only had a voice, but voted in the business meetings. One of the most perplexing difficulties I met with at the beginning of my religious work in the South was the marriage question. Not that phase of the question that is often debated, is marriage a failure, but how to join together those who wanted to be joined in matrimony. During the days of slavery, slaves were married according to the state law, but lived together more on the concubinage order. The husband and wife, after living together long enough to have children, were often separated and sold into different parts of the South, never to see each other again. And thus separated, they were encouraged to marry again and raise children for the slave market. As I have intimated, Virginia and Richmond especially was the great slave market that furnished the majority of the slaves for the rest of the South. Now that freedom had been proclaimed throughout the land, hundreds of those who had been separated returned to their former home. But they found their former companions married again, they, of course, expecting never to see them again. Now here came the difficulty. As the marriage of the slaves consisted only in common consent among themselves and their masters, the state law had nothing to do with it. Therefore, special legislative enactment had to be made to meet the case. Thereupon the legislature passed a law recognizing all living together as man and wife. After this they had to be married according to the state law. Just before and after this enactment, a large number came to see me to be married, 7 and 8 couples a night. The perplexing part was, as I have intimated, to determine which were the right ones to marry. This state of things existed not only in Virginia, but all through the South. There was great need of competent pastors to meet this and other phases of religious work. Accordingly, several who were thought to be fitted for the work were set apart and ordained to the ministry with the authority to marry, and the Freedmen's Bureau granting them the proper license to perform the ceremony. I might here mention a few of the many who were at that time set apart for the work. Reverend Richard Wells, who succeeded me as pastor of the Ebenezer and is still pastor at this writing. Reverend Fields Cook, Reverend Scott Goffney, Reverend John Jasper, who has attracted the attention of the world with his idea that the sun moves around the earth. Reverend W. Robinson, Reverend John White, Reverend Ned Gentry, Reverend Jordan Smith, and others. These men have had good records and accomplished much for their race. I must say that my work at the Ebenezer was one of joy as well as difficulty. It was my pleasure to receive many into the church by baptism, and during my 4½ years pastorate, to see the membership increase from 600 to 1,400. During my stay with the church, I had several of my white friends from Boston, Massachusetts, to visit me and see the nature of the work I was doing. It may not be out of the way here for me to mention a few names in this connection. The first is that of Mr. John Lovett, of the firm of James Lovett & Co. Mr. Lovett was much impressed with the congregation. He had never looked upon such an assembly as he faced in my church. The congregation to him seemed to have the appearance of Joseph's coat, conspicuous for its many colors. He afterward inquired about this peculiar composition of the audience, and wanted to know if white people were accustomed to attend regularly at the church. I took the opportunity to inform him that the people whom he supposed to be white were not white, but colored, according to the statutes of the South. "Why," said he, "they are as white as I am." I admitted the truth of his statement, but further explained by saying that the condition of the colored child usually followed its mother, regardless of the white parentage. That is to say, if the mother was considered colored, the child was considered the same, though the father was white. This same gentleman was much amused with a little incident that happened while he was present. I had in the pulpit with me a brother minister who was overcome by the heat and labor of the day, and was inclined to fall in the arms of sweet sleep. At intervals during my discourse I would put my hand on this brother and endeavor to arouse him. This seems to have made such an impression on my friend Mr. Lovett that years afterward he would joke me about it, and relate the same to his friends. Mr. Isaac Fenno, who was always thoughtful and kind to me, and assisted me in my work among the freedmen, also visited Richmond during my stay. On the occasion of his visit I happened to preach in the old African, or better known now as the First Baptist Church. He was in the audience, but I did not know it until I was through my discourse. When I spied him in the congregation, I made haste, like Zacchaeus, to come down and shake him by the hand, for I was more than truly glad to see him there, knowing as I did the deep interest he had in my people. The handshake he gave me that morning was valuable as well as warm and sympathetic, for there was left from it a $10 print in my hand. Such handshakes were not unwelcome in those days. Mr. William B. Spooner, of whom I have spoken before, also made a visit, and because of his special interest and relation to the work among the freedmen, made a good report. Messrs. Walden and Haskell, the well-known tanners of Salem, must also be mentioned as among those who visited Richmond and inspected the nature of the work we were doing. These gentlemen I have spoken of had more than a personal curiosity in the work I was doing, for they had aided me financially in prosecuting the same, and the visits made fully satisfied them as to the merits and faithfulness of the work. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of From Slave Cabin to Pulpit by Peter Randolph. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, Religion at the Close of the War. I wish to speak now concerning the general religious status of the colored people at the close of the war, and their relation to their white brethren. During the heated discussions of slavery and the war conflict, the religious denominations North and South divided on the subject of slavery, the Northern brethren believing it was wrong to hold slaves, the Southern brethren that it was right. The colored people at this time, of course, had no religious rights more than what their masters allowed them, but now, by the shock of war, they had come into possession of manhood rights. To what wing of the denomination would they ally themselves, to the Southern or Northern? At the close of the war, the colored Baptists found that the Southern Baptists had formed resolutions against the Northern Baptists and desired to have no communication with them. At the same time, the Northern brethren were doing much to help the religious life of the colored people. The Southern Baptists wanted the colored brethren to ally themselves with them. This the colored brethren hesitated to do because they considered the Northern brethren their friends. When the proposition was made to us by our white brethren, our reply was that we would consent on these conditions. First, that they would take back all they had claimed and said against the Baptists of the North, and second, that they would meet us as Christian brethren, and not as slaves. A meeting was appointed for both white and colored to consider the suggestions. I was appointed by the colored brethren to represent them, and Reverend Mr. Sands, who had preached for the colored people in Manchester, to represent the whites. The said Sands was not only a preacher, but a member of the Virginia bar, a lawyer by profession. We met in one of the churches to talk the matter over. His opinion was that the conditions were too strong. After we had interchanged views on the subject, we adjourned to meet again at the call of the committee. When the second meeting was called, Reverend Dr. Burroughs spoke for the same, and did much to persuade the colored Baptists to affiliate with the white. But as this was the first time in the history of the colored Baptists that we had had to make terms, we were inclined to hold to our propositions. A third meeting was called, in which my old friend Dr. Jeter spoke for the white brethren. But this meeting was similar to the other two, as far as the result was concerned, for the colored brethren seemed fully determined as before. Finally, the white brethren abandoned the attempt, feeling, if not expressing it in words, that Ephraim was joined to his idols, the Northern Baptists. The reasons why our white brethren wanted us to affiliate with them I may not be able to give. Certainly they were very loud in declaring that we had no men who were competent and fit to preach and to act as pastors, but experience has proved the contrary. I think I voice the sentiment of my brethren when I say that we chose rather to grope our way in the dark than to have thrust upon us that kind of preachers we had had in the dark days of slavery, men who could neither sympathize with us nor preach us the full gospel. Besides, we knew that our white brethren denied our manhood, and with their own hands had bought and sold human flesh. If we were poor and ignorant, we wanted to be consistent. I recall here an incident that will help to illustrate my meaning. About the time of which I am speaking, a Northern missionary by the name of John Vasey offered Dr. Burroughs a Bible as a present. The doctor refused it because of his feeling and attitude toward the North. If the doctor, after having a fair fight with the North, refused the Bible on the ground of consistency, what could he have expected of us, the colored Baptists, who hadn't a half of a chance? At any rate, we felt that we were justified in coming out and forming a separate organization. Accordingly, a convention of the colored Baptists of Richmond and vicinity was called for the purpose of considering plans of permanent organization. The meeting convened in the Ebenezer Church, of which I was the pastor, and formed themselves into what is known as the Shiloh Baptist Association of Virginia. Your humble servant was chosen as the first president, and John Oliver the secretary. The said John Oliver was formerly of Boston, but went South immediately at the close of the war, and rendered much service for his people. I am proud to say that this association has been productive of much good among the colored Baptists of Virginia. The question may be asked, how was I treated in Richmond by the local white people during my stay there of nearly 5 years? In part answer to such a query, I would say that I was treated as well as could be expected under the circumstances. Of course, there was a bitter feeling against all persons who hailed from the North, whether they were black or white. And naturally I came in for my share. Doubtless a few incidents will better illustrate this point than I can describe it in language. On account of the active interest I took in my people, there were some who were inclined to look upon me as a kind of a spy in behalf of the government. Some time after I had relinquished my work and interest in the courts, I was asked one day by a local white gentleman how much I had received for my service. When I answered him nothing, he further remarked that "many of us thought you were a government spy sent here to watch us." It was a duty as well as a pleasure for me to correct this false impression. I may say here that once, during my 2 years' service in the courts, looking after the interests of the colored people, I did receive something, but not from any political source. It happened in this wise. A poor old colored woman had lost her husband by death. The physician who attended him during his illness sued this poor widow for the house she lived in, which was valued at $500. She engaged a lawyer to defend her, but when the case was called, the lawyer could not be found. I represented her before the judge, and her house was saved. This old woman was so pleased and gratified for what I had done, that she brought me $2.50 in gold. I refused it, but she insisted that I should take it, or she would be displeased. I took the money, and that is the only compensation that I ever received for my service of 2 years. For a while, to say the least, the white South had to endure the presence of the white Yankees, but the black or "negger Yankees" they did not want to see or come in contact with. Once I called at a lady's residence to see her servant, and while in the kitchen the lady herself came in, and the cook introduced me as the pastor of one of the colored churches, and that I was from the North. She politely recognized me and intimated that she was glad to see me. Then at once she proceeded to speak adversely of the Northern people, by saying that they were very mean and stingy, while the Southern people were kind and liberal. I remarked that the Northern people had to work hard for their money, and they were careful how they used it. She extended her remarks by saying that she had an old auntie, referring to an old colored woman by name, that the Yankees had set free, but now she was poor and suffering for the necessities of life. I asked her about how much money did she think this colored woman, to whom she referred, had earned for her during her time of enslavement. "Well," she said, "likely some thousands." This remark caused me to say, "Then, madam, she is entitled to her earnings, is she not?" She expressed herself to the effect that she believed the colored people were made servants for the white people. I differed with her, and we entered into a discussion of the history of races. She was kind and considerate in her address, and I endeavored to be the same. And thus ended our meeting. I was informed that when her husband came home, she told him that a "negger Yankee" had been in her yard, and about what I had said to her. He expressed himself as being indignant, and regretted that he was not present, so that he might introduce me to the toe of his boot. Of course, I avoided that yard in the future. I must say, however, that I was frequently sent for by other Southern white people to marry their servants or preach the funerals. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of From Slave Cabin to Pulpit by Peter Randolph. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, A Distinction. I am always glad and ready to make the distinction that all white people are not alike, a distinction that many white people are unwilling to make relative to colored people. I do not say or believe that because one white man robs a bank and runs away with the people's money, that all white men are thieves and robbers, but the general verdict among white people seems to be that if one colored man steals, all will steal. There are some white people in the South whom I consider to be very good people, though they were slave owners. Many of them had feelings against slavery, and rejoiced that it was abolished. The opinion of ex-Governor Henry A. Wise, who hung John Brown, will be in place here. I heard Mr. Wise, before Judge Underwood in the United States Court, make a statement something like the following in substance. While in the course of his argument he turned towards the colored people, and pointing his finger directly at them, said, "There is the bone of our contention, and I am glad it is gone, for I knew that slavery and freedom could not exist together in the United States. I tried to get the thing committed to arbitration, and the North, as well as the South, is responsible for its existence, for it was in the original compact, and both sections were a party to it." This utterance of the ex-governor of Virginia has always haunted me. Was the North, as well as the South, responsible for slavery? This question will doubtless be asked by the generations that are to follow us, and they, more removed from the scenes of conflict, will unhesitatingly give the proper answer. The mills of justice grind slow, but they grind exceedingly fine. I am glad to admit also that a great change has come over the whole country since the close of the war in regard to the opinions concerning the colored people. This is seen in the method of travel, North and South. In some parts of the North, the colored people were denied many of the privileges that they now enjoy. I remember on one occasion I was returning to Richmond from Boston, when, arriving at New York, I met the Hon. Frederick Douglass, and we rode together to Philadelphia, where he was to lecture. On our arrival at the depot, we took a horse car for another part of the city. We had boarded the car, Mr. Douglass had taken a seat inside, and I was on the platform. When the conductor got to me, he informed me that I must get off the car. I asked him why. He replied he had no argument to make, but I must get off and take the Jim Crow car. I told him that he would have to take the responsibility of putting me off. The conductor, for some reason, had not spied Douglass seated in the car. Mr. Douglass at this moment sung out, and wanted to know what was the matter. The aforesaid gentleman was surprised, and exclaimed, "What are you doing out there?" Douglass continued by saying, "Let that man alone. That is Reverend Peter Randolph from Boston, Massachusetts." "And who are you?" said the conductor, half mad, and thinking that he was contributing something for the amusement of the passengers. The quick reply was, "That is Frederick Douglass." By this time some of the gentlemen in the car, who had heard the name of Massachusetts and Frederick Douglass, interfered and told the conductor to let those men alone, that they had no objection to riding with them. The name of Massachusetts seemed to have had a salutary effect in that car in putting things to right. Long may she live and hold her place in the front rank of the nation, and exert an influence from ocean to ocean for the oppressed. I believe in that statement which says the wheels of progress never go backward, but forward. I have strong faith in the rule of conscience, and I believe that many of the hindrances that now impede the progress of my people will be removed, and that there will be better facilities and greater opportunities for them. I regret exceedingly that there are some, who term themselves ministers of the gospel, who are constantly holding up to public ridicule the immoral and degraded condition of some colored people, and trying to prove that the colored people as a race are unfit for citizenship. At this writing, a prominent minister of New York City, writing on the condition of the colored people, calls them bastards, and says they are immoral and superstitious. It may be that some are without legitimate fathers, and some are immoral and superstitious, but the same may be said of some white people, in almost every thickly settled community. But what would any minister, or any one else, dare to say all were such? If he did, he would be called a lunatic. Before the white South parades the Negro's immorality before the world, let her ask herself and conscience, what has the South done to improve the degraded condition of the colored people? And is she free from all responsibility in this matter? The preacher for the time should be uncompromising in the truth, not making an apology for sin and wrongdoing, not covering up hypocrisy, but uncovering it, and teaching men the awful consequences of sin. Theodore Parker did not fail to criticize the ministers of the gospel for neglecting the weightier matters of the law. What we need are more men of his character, who are able to arouse public sentiment in behalf of the outraged and the oppressed. I believe that this age will yet produce brave and noble men who, like Parker, Sumner, and Phillips, will champion the cause of the weak and downtrodden, and that they will continue to carry on the glorious work begun by their predecessors. Truth, crushed to earth, shall rise again. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of From Slave Cabin to Pulpit by Peter Randolph. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Special Traits. The colored people have often been criticized for their emotional and sympathetic traits. I hold that this emotional element is an important adjunct to the progress of humanity. All nationalities have their peculiar traits of character, which, blended with others, add or detract in the great progress of humanity. The Negro race is deeply sympathetic and emotional, the latter resulting from the former. For where there is deep sympathy, there will be emotion more or less. In the religious worship of the colored people, perhaps, this element of emotion finds its greatest opportunity for display. The Negro is deeply religious, his sympathies run in that direction. He is in full sympathy with religion, and expresses it in his emotions. Now, this emotional element produces enthusiasm, and fires up the cold and indifferent. More enthusiasm is what is wanted in all the avenues of life. Then it follows naturally, as the night follows the day, that a deep, sympathetic, and enthusiastic nature is necessary as a supplement to one that is cold and indifferent. I admit that some of the demonstrations manifested on the part of many of the colored people in their religious meetings are not proper, for they are carried to extremes. The meetings carried on till a late hour, the groaning and shouting, the getting happy and falling over benches, are features that should be discouraged. All this, doubtless, is the result of a deep religious nature, rough and uncultivated, the overflow of a strong and buoyant spirit. Now, what must be done with this nature? Destroy it? What should be done with a rough and uncultivated yet productive soil? The iron ore and unpolished diamond. Destroy them? The foolish and ignorant could only say, destroy them. But wisdom and experience would say, cultivate, refine, and polish them, and you will have something that will be useful and ornamental. So, in regard to the emotional element in the Negro, cultivate, refine, and polish it, and you will have that which maketh not ashamed, but desirable, adding strength and beauty in the great temple of progress. This sympathetic element is not only seen in the religious worship of the colored people, but also in their daily contact. The Negro is domestic. He loves home, wife, and children, and is easily moved to tears by the affliction of any of these. In the dark days of slavery, when parents and children were forced to separate, and that not once, but often, at each separation the scenes of affection were heartrending. I have conducted funerals where it would not be unusual to see nearly the whole adult congregation bathed in tears, while in some white congregations it would be difficult to observe but few, if any, weeping. Not that the white people do not feel for their beloved dead, but that the manifestation of it does not show itself, as in the case of the Negro. Often at the graves of their masters who had whipped and sold them into slavery, the slaves were seen to weep, not tears of joy, but of sympathy and sorrow. This emotional element that is manifested in the Negro's life is usually sincere and without sham or hypocrisy. Often in the religious meetings the visitor is caused to smile and laugh out loud at what appears to him to be amusing, if not ridiculous. But the worshippers, perspiring at every pore, were never more in earnest and never more sincere. And what is more, this sincerity on the part of the colored people have caused their critics to make allowance for their eccentricities. Now, I maintain, as I have already intimated, that this emotional or enthusiastic element in the colored people, which is natural, is capable of being turned to great good. To deny the possibility of their development and high state of cultivation is to deny the current facts of history. Negroes from the Southern plantations and tobacco factories have stood as representatives in the legislative halls to champion and defend the rights of man. In all the professions they are found, and when opportunity is given, they are ready and able to compete with their more favored brothers for the honors. The fact that the soil will produce one hill of corn is an evidence that it will produce another. What man has done, it is reasonable to suppose man can do under similar and favorable circumstances. What then must be our conclusion in this matter? This: encourage the Negro to develop the resources that are within him. He has patience, for he has been the great back horse and burden-bearer of America. He has sincere faith in God, and enjoys his religion. With his patience, sincerity, and enthusiasm, he will help to evangelize the world. After my 4 years and a half of active service in Richmond and vicinity, I returned again to Boston, my former home. I found on my arrival that a large number of colored people had gathered here from different parts of the South in search of homes and employment. The name Boston always had a musical and joyous sound to the colored people in the South. This was not unreasonable, for this city was foremost in advocating the Negro's cause and vouchsafing to him the immunities of citizenship. May this grand old city always hold the first place in the Negro's affection. It may be that this fact, Boston's friendship for the Negro, had a little to do with a large number coming to Boston. Be that as it may, the fact is, I found a large number scattered in and about the south end of the city who were recently from the South. Many of these were like sheep without a shepherd, leaving their churches in the South behind them, and having no church affiliations here. Owing to the habits and customs in the South, and also their mode of worship, only a few ventured to visit the white churches. I flattered myself as knowing somewhat the needs of my people. After talking the matter over with several brethren, and consulting with my old friend, Deacon Ezekias Chase, I decided to take hold of the work and do what I could to build up a Baptist church at the South End. Already the good people at Clarendon Street Baptist Church, of which Rev. A.J. Gordon was the honored pastor, had begun work among the children by forming a Sunday school. This Sunday school, under the auspices of the Clarendon Street folks, was held every Sunday at 1210 Washington Street. I noticed that a number of the parents of these children would occasionally drop in at this school. The thought occurred to me that this was the place to begin a church. Accordingly, the church was started with a handful of earnest men and women. All movements, secular and religious, have opposers and obstacles. This struggling branch was no exception to the rule. One of the difficulties I had to contend with during the services in this hall, or place of our first meeting, was the presence of a club of young men in the adjoining apartment. While I was preaching, the voices of these men could be audibly heard in my congregation. One would sing out, "I pass," another, "I have jack," trumps, spades, and such expressions as are common to card players. Doubtless their idea was to get us disgusted and cause us to leave, that they might continue their gambling on the Lord's Day. We continued to preach, and finally that peculiar noise of the cards falling on the table ceased, and the young men, evidently, sat quietly listening to us. At length they would not gamble at all during the religious service, but would come in and sit in our audience. Their faces and appearances indicated that they were not the best class of young men. I believe our preaching had a good effect upon them, for when we left the hall for the want of more room, and selected another place of worship, some of these young men continued to visit our services. During our stay in the hall on Washington Street, our numbers were greatly augmented, and we removed from there to the church edifice on West Concord Street, a more commodious place of worship. The latter was secured to us through the kindness of Rev. George C. Lorimer, D.D., and the dear brethren at the Clarendon Street Baptist Church. Dr. Lorimer, at this time, was the pastor of the First Baptist Church, located on Sawmet Avenue and Rutland Street. Before we entered the Concord Street Meeting House, which seated about 500 people, the church was organized and recognized as the Ebenezer Baptist. I cannot say too much in the way of commendation and praise of the Clarendon Street folks for their hearty sympathy, cooperation, and financial aid which was extended to us, nor too much of the beloved and lamented Deacon Ezekias Chase, who for 40 years had been my personal friend. He, with many others, have finished their earthly career, and have gone to receive the reward of the faithful. At Concord Street our congregation was largely increased, and we had a number of candidates ready for baptism. Unfortunately for us, we had no pool in our church, and was compelled to go elsewhere in order to perform the rite. Through the kindness of Dr. Gordon and his officers, our first baptism was observed at the Clarendon Street Baptist Church. According to the arrangements, on a certain Sunday morning, after the doctor's sermon to his congregation, I appeared on the scene with 21 candidates, and a large part of my congregation following me. Most of the doctor's congregation had never witnessed what they called a colored baptism, and they remained to see the performance of the same. I have already intimated that most of these people were recently from the South, and their habits and customs were their only heritage from slavery. I had cautioned them beforehand that, as they were going to Dr. Gordon's church to be baptized, they must be as careful and calm as possible. But I'm sorry to say that most of them forgot my advice. The first one I immersed showed a little sign of excitement, and the second a little more, so the excitement increased gradually till some got happy in the water, and so on. At the beginning of the excitement, Dr. Gordon arose and dismissed his congregation, intimating that it was doubtless best for us to be alone, as we had some ways peculiar to ourselves. He might have added that we had learned these in the house of bondage. There was one noticeable feature that attracted some attention. As I was baptizing one man who was quite dark, all at once a voice shouted out in the gallery, "That's my husband!" Many of the congregation mistook her for a white woman, but she was a bright mulatto. Rev. Dr. Gordon deeply sympathized with me in my embarrassed condition, and I was so ashamed of the action of my people that I never went there to baptize again. The Ebenezer Church continued to increase in membership and influence until today it is one of the largest colored churches in Boston. True, the church has had many changes in the pastorate, and this doubtless could not very well be avoided, owing to the composition of the membership and congregation. These were mainly uneducated people, not from one part of the South only, but from different parts. Few had any definite idea of church government, yet all had some idea as to how a Baptist church should be carried on, that is, they thought they did. Those who came from Virginia had their ideas as to how a church should be conducted, and likewise those who came from North Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, or Florida had theirs also. Each different set wanted their kind of a preacher, and the majority usually carried the day. The uneducated minister would naturally go with the crowd that voted for his coming. With this peculiar membership, the minister would not have smooth sailing all the time. The remedy for this Babel state of affairs will come through the intelligent, educated ministry, which shall enlighten the people and bring them up to the correct standard, and not appeal to their ignorant methods inherited from slavery. What is needed also is more cooperation on the part of the white brethren in this whole matter. This applies to colored churches all over the country. Give the churches better leaders, educated and trained in all doctrine. This the white people must do, for the colored people are poor and have nothing. Having relieved myself of the work and responsibility of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, I still remained in Boston and vicinity, ready to help in every good work where my services were wanted. Owing to my relation to the churches and old acquaintance in the city, I was constantly called upon to officiate at funerals, address organizations, and different societies. Frequently I was called to other cities and towns to preach and supply vacant pulpits. In Providence, Rhode Island, I supplied the Ebenezer Church there for 1 year, and my stay was blessed with much success. While serving this church, I met there some of my relations who were sold from the Brandon plantation on the James River, that I spoke of in the previous chapters. We were unknown to each other until we found out where we came from. This may seem amusing to some, but it is a common thing among colored people to meet in one another's company for years and not know that they are near kin until some incident occurs like this. In many of the larger cities and towns in the North, and especially in New England, like Providence, Worcester, New Bedford, Springfield, New Haven, Hartford, and Newport, there is a large population of colored people, the majority of whom came from the South since the war. They are usually the poorer class of colored people who come to better their condition. Some come direct from the plantations, others from the cities and tobacco factories. As a rule, all are hard-working people, and where they get fair wages and kind treatment, they will work themselves nearly to death. In the South, their great social and religious enjoyment has come through their church life, and naturally they seek such affiliations as soon as they arrive. In many places they are too poor and too few in number to have a self-sustaining church, and ought to remain as a mission under some white church that is willing and able to instruct and assist them. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of From Slave Cabin to Pulpit by Peter Randolph. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, In Many Fields. Some of the white Protestant churches have done noble work along this line. The Clarendon Street Baptist Church, of which I spoke, is a good illustration of this fact. But most of the white churches, for some reason, are indifferent or soon tire of the work. The Catholic Church of Rome is taking advantage of this indifference on the part of Protestants toward their colored brother. The progress of the Church of Rome among the colored people for the last few years will surprise anyone who will look into the subject. The colored people of America in the main are Protestants, and so inclined. It will be no credit to the Protestant Church of America to let the Church of Rome capture these out of her hands. It has been my privilege to visit many of these scattered and weak churches, and do what I could to help them. Worcester, Mass. was also one of the places where I labored for a short time, endeavoring to build up the people. The colored Baptists there, as elsewhere, were weak and struggling for existence. I presented their interest to the white brethren of the denomination, but they were slow to take hold of the work, and rather inclined to criticize the colored people for their mode of worship. This, I tried to show, was the result of the institution of slavery, for which the whole country was in part responsible. At the close of my remarks, a brother minister arose and said that he was very much interested in what I had to say; and while continuing, he said to the congregation, "Brethren, we may not, as individuals, have injured the colored people, but we have as a nation, and we might just as well acknowledge it." How much better was this simple testimony to the truth than all the skilled and apologetic arguments made in defense of the wrong against the colored people. When Joseph's brethren had time to think and talk the matter over, they said one to the other, "We have wronged our brother." When the American people have had plenty of time to think over their relation to their colored brother, they will make the acknowledgment that the brothers of Joseph made, "We have wronged our brother." I alluded to the testimony of the minister at Worcester because it was an exceptional thing for a clergyman to speak out as he did. In the dark days of slavery, there was hardly one minister out of 100 that spoke in behalf of the oppressed slave; and today the same might almost be said of the ministers in the South and the North, relative to the barbarous and inhuman outrages committed on the colored people. This is a Christian nation, yet the burning of colored people at the stake is of frequent occurrence. We tremble and shudder when we read Fox's Book of Martyrs, but who is affected at the burning of negroes alive in the South? The pulpit should speak out against this blot on American Christian civilization, but it is conspicuous for its silence. We need another Webster to say, "If the pulpit is silent, she is false to her trust." Speaking of the colored people and the difficulties they have in their church affairs reminds me of a visit I made to Cleveland, Ohio, some years ago. In conversation with the deacon of the First Baptist Church, he turned on this phase of the subject with the colored churches. He spoke of the difficulties he had experienced in the early history of his own church, and expressed himself as not being surprised at the troubles the colored congregations had; for coming, as many of them did, from different parts of the South, uneducated and untrained, confusion was rather expected. This deacon's view is the most intelligent and charitable that I have heard from a white brother concerning the colored churches in the North. His idea on this point is worthy of repetition. Certainly, if the white churches, with all their intelligence and systems, have church fusses, what must be expected where there is no system and no education to speak of? If the green tree can barely escape, How will the dry tree be affected? The progress that some of these churches have made, in spite of difficulties, is an evidence that there are possibilities within the Church which, if properly cared for, will make them efficient and self-supporting. My work at Mashpee among the Indians also claims a brief mention in these notes. Mashpee, Gayhead, and many other settlements in the vicinity of Cape Cod are distinguished for their Indian descendants. In the early days of New England history, some of the most warlike tribes lived in this neighborhood. Of course, the remnant that now remains is not the genuine article, but a mixture of white and colored people by intermarriage. Still, there is much that is characteristic of the Indian. The people at Gayhead and Mashpee have remained somewhat to themselves in a separate reservation, have their own schools and churches, and in the main they are farmers and fishermen. Some of the best whalers that have chased after the kingfish have come from among these half-Indian young men. The Gayhead boys have made themselves prominent by the bravery that was exhibited in rescuing the survivors from the wrecked steamer City of Columbus. I found the Mashpee people to be kind, intelligent, and lovers of their church, and though my stay among them was of short duration, they were well pleased with the service I rendered them as a preacher. Their church was located a little back in the woods on a hill, and close by a stream. Tradition says that this stream or pond was the favorite trout fishing ground for Daniel Webster, the great statesman. While supplying this church, I met here a friend of mine from Boston who was not considered much of a churchgoer. He expressed the idea that he would like to hear me preach. Accordingly, like Nicodemus, he sought a bypath which led indirectly to the church, and sat on the outside to listen while the worshipers were assembled inside. He took his departure, however, before the congregation was dismissed, and no one saw him come or go. He informed some members of the church that he had been to the church and heard me preach, and to convince them, he related a story that I told of a man crossing a river with his sheep, which he characterized as that sheep story. The last time I met him in Boston, he wanted to know about that old sheep story. As I was the first colored preacher to supply these people, they turned out en masse on the first Sunday, and manifested much curiosity, expecting to see me get happy, jump up, and shout. Happily for them, they were forced to change their minds on this respect. Nantucket, which seems to be cut off from the rest of the world, cannot be reached by the pedestrian, but he who would reach its shores must go by the way of the briny deep. I had made arrangements to supply the Baptist church on this island for a short time, but the Sunday I was expected I did not arrive, because there was so much water between myself and the island. It has been the rule of my life always to be punctual in regard to my appointments, and doubtless much of the success I have had is due to this fact. But this is one of the times that I got left. I had been misdirected as to the direct course to Nantucket, and after going a station or two out of my way, I had to return and start again, and accordingly, when I arrived at Hyannis on the Cape, where I was to take the steamer, the boat, not waiting for me, had taken its departure, and there would not be another until Monday morning. I was informed also that the next train back to Boston would be on Monday morning. This was anything but consolation. I was at two extremes, the end of the railroad and at my wits' end. Here I found myself in a strange place and among strange people, and must remain half the day Saturday and all day Sunday. What to do was the question. I inquired for the Baptist pastor and found one, Rev. J. Bronston by name. He met me at his door as a gentleman and a Christian. I related to him my story and disappointment in not reaching Nantucket. He extended to me the hospitalities of his home, and invited me to remain over Sunday. I attended the service in his church in the morning. The theme of his discourse was the providence of God in the affairs of men. He referred to me as an illustration of the subject. How, in the providence of God, I was prevented from going to Nantucket, that I might remain in Hyannis over Sunday. The subject and the manner in which he treated it made a great impression upon me. He announced to his congregation that I would preach in the evening, and give some account of my slave life and advent to Boston. Accordingly, at the evening service, a large congregation was present. I did the best I could in the way of preaching, and related some facts of my slave life, how I came to Boston in 1847 with 66 companions, and so on. One of the pleasant and surprising things to me was, that there was an old brother in the audience who remembered the time of our arrival, and was one among the crowd that greeted us at Long Wharf, Boston. The presence of this gentleman gave a double emphasis to all I had to say on this point. On Monday morning I took my departure from Hyannis, believing firmer than ever that the providence of God guides in the affairs of men. In crossing that part of the Atlantic that lies between Nantucket and the mainland, one must not look for all smooth sailing. If so, doubtless there will be some disappointment, but you must be willing to smell and taste a little of old ocean. On reaching Nantucket I was much impressed with the place and its people, though the first impression was not a very favorable one, for I was looking for a larger town and more activity among the people. It was certainly a sea-girt island, and ancient in its architectural structures. The people were of a mixed population, with much of the Indian element, whose main occupation was that of fishing. In the early days of whale fishery, Nantucket was one of the leading ports. The people are proud of their history, and take great delight in showing strangers dilapidated buildings that are distinguished for their age. The traditional history of the name Nantucket seems to be quite familiar among the young people. They will tell you about the 3 islands the Sovereign of England gave to his 3 daughters, Martha, Elizabeth, and Nancy. The first 2 were taken by Martha and Elizabeth, and called respectively Martha's Vineyard and Elizabeth Islands. As there was only one left, Nan, she took it, and the island bears the name of Nantucket, because Nancy took it. I cannot say positively that Nancy got the best of the 3 islands, for when I discovered that I had to eat clams or fast, knowing that I was not too fond of that fish, I desired to be in a more convenient place. On the whole, my stay at Nantucket was pleasant, and I have made several visits to the island. I will also briefly state that I preached for a while in Albany, New York, and also served the church at West Newton, Massachusetts, for 1 year. All these fields I have mentioned include the time after my return from the South. Doubtless much of the work done in these fields was imperfect, but I have had occasion to rejoice again and again at the result of the seed that was sown. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of From Slave Cabin to Pulpit by Peter Randolph. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, The Law. As I was born a slave in the South, and deprived of all educational advantages, the opportunity for self-improvement, after my emancipation, I rarely allowed to go by, though I had a family to support. When I was pastor at New Haven, I availed myself of the public lectures that were given. Also, in like manner, when I was in Richmond, Virginia, I attended the school for preachers there, and I always sought the presence and companionship of those who were able to help me through the conversation and discussion of important subjects. Accordingly, soon after I gave up the active pastorate of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, Boston, I entered the law office of E.G. Walker, Esq., and read law for a while, not with a view of practicing, but for the sake of a more definite idea of the common law. With this general knowledge I thought I could render much acceptable service to many of my people who are ignorant of their environments and the laws that govern them. I was made a Justice of the Peace under Governor Washburne, and reappointed by Governor Long and Governor Ames, respectively. While in this capacity I rendered helpful service to some of my people; but as this was not my calling, I did not continue in it very long. Before closing these brief but important sketches of my life, from slavery to freedom, I wish to relate a pleasant episode that happened on one of my return visits from Richmond to Boston. Owing to the ill health of my wife and family, it was necessary for me to make stated visits to the North, at the same time availing myself of the opportunity of informing and interesting my friends in the Southern work. During one of these visits I happened in the Boston post office one day, and on entering my eyes rested on what appeared to be a flat pocket book. I examined the contents, and found the name of Charles Vinell attached. I inquired of the delivery clerk if he knew of such a person. He informed me that the said Vinell had called for letters, and that he resided down on Cape Cod. I was acquainted with one Deacon Vinell, who lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and had his office with Gardner Colby. Accordingly, I called on Mr. Vinell, told him my story of the pocketbook, and asked him if he knew this Mr. Vinell from the Cape. He informed me that he often did business with him, and that he was a distant relative of his. In the meantime, Mr. Vinell, the owner of the pocketbook, was exercising himself not a little in search of his property. He had visited 5 different places to see if he had left it there. His agitation of mind can better be imagined than described. Doubtless he scratched his head more than once where it did not itch, endeavoring to stir up his memory, for that wallet contained what might be regarded by some as a small fortune. Finally he found his way back to the post office, which at that time was located on State Street. As he entered, full of excitement, the clerk anticipated him by saying, "You have lost your pocketbook, sir." He intimated he had, and that he had been hunting everywhere he had gone for it, and wanted to know if any one had seen it in the office. The post office clerk assured him that the purse had been found, and was safe in the hands of a colored man whom he knew, the Rev. Peter Randolph, who was preaching among the freedmen in the South, and that he could be found at the office of Gardner Colby. He forthwith struck a bee line for this office, where I happened to be at the time. As he entered, some one said to me, "That is Mr. Vinell." As he came in, with his face radiant with a smile, I approached him and said, "You have lost your pocketbook, sir." He seemed too full for utterance, and gave only smiles for answer. As I returned the pocketbook, I asked him how much it contained. "Something over $5,000, was the reply. As he received it, he said, "Now, what shall I give you?" "Anything you please, sir." He gave me $5 and an invitation to visit him at his home on the Cape. A few days after this I read in the papers that a colored boy from Richmond, Virginia, had picked up a purse of $5,000, and was liberally rewarded with $5. This newspaper article gave 2 impressions that I wanted to correct. The first was that I was not a boy, but a man, considered old enough to vote, if nothing else. So accordingly I called on Mr. Haskell, editor of the Transcript, and related to him the correct story relative to the pocketbook. He published the same in his paper, and informed the public that I was not the boy spoken of, but the Rev. Peter Randolph, who was pastor of a large church in Richmond. The second impression I wanted corrected was that I was not complaining because of what Mr. Vinell gave me, for I considered him the only rightful possessor of the purse and contents. When my many friends learned that I was the person who had found the money, they came together and presented me with a present of some $200. I accepted Mr. Vinell's invitation, and made him a visit at the Cape, which was very pleasant and profitable, and through his influence I was able to solicit the sympathy and cooperation of several friends in the Southern work. If there is any moral to this pocketbook story, it is this: honesty is always the best policy, and brings its own reward. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of From Slave Cabin to Pulpit by Peter Randolph. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, Retrospect. The river has its bend, and the longest road must terminate. As I look backward and take a retrospective view of my past toils and sorrows, and the vicissitudes through which I have passed, I feel that I have much to be thankful for. I am grateful to Almighty God for emancipation from cruel Southern bondage, and for directing my course to liberty-loving Massachusetts. I am thankful to that noble band of men and women who, by pen and tongue, acting under the highest impulse, did not hesitate to perform their duty in behalf of outraged and oppressed humanity. I shall never forget those brave and patriotic men who, tearing themselves from the embrace of their families, hastened to the scene of conflict and poured out their dearest blood for freedom and right. I thank God for the unity and good feeling that exist between the North and the South, for the material prosperity of which we have a right to boast, and join with others in the grand anthems of praise, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty." God bless our native land, and firm may she ever stand. But with all my gratitude and praise, I still feel ashamed of the present condition of our colored Americans in this great country. A candid review of that condition will show that it is far from what it ought to be, in view of the great loss of blood and treasure. The sacrifices and insults that the anti-slavery folks were forced to endure, the suffering and privations of the soldiers on the battlefield and in prison pens, the loss of over 1 million lives and 8 billions of money, should have been sufficient to dig a grave so deep for slavery that it would never rise again to vex the country in any form. Doubtless there are many who think this has been done, and done once for all. I sincerely hope so. But, as in the days of slavery, so now I hear the voice of my oppressed brethren in the South, crying for help and protection. Protection from the lash, shotgun, lynching, and that most fiendish custom, which was unknown in the days of slavery, the burning of colored people alive at the stake. These, my outraged brethren, have again and again waited upon the President through their delegations, and presented to him their grievances. The delegations have been politely received, only to be informed that the President could do nothing. They have returned to their homes to be abused the more for daring to complain of the treatment accorded them by the white South. Outrageous methods are resorted to in order to defraud the poor people out of their honest toil, and deprive them of their civil and political rights. Many of these methods are known to both white and colored. If the colored citizens dare to come together and defend themselves and their homes, the attacking party raise the cry of race riot, and forthwith the state militia hurries to the scene to shoot and abuse the colored people only. White men who condemn and speak out against this condition of affairs are gagged or forced to leave the section for a more congenial clime. The pulpit and press, which are recognized forces in every community, encourage rather than condemn the persecution of the colored people; the pulpit by its silence, the press by actually urging it on. A colored man may be arrested on suspicion of crime, and before his trial, or even he reaches jail, the Southern press publishes to the world that a black fiend has been arrested, and it is likely he will be lynched. The white South seems to think the colored Americans have but few rights that they are bound to respect, and they have the colored people in their hands as clay in the hands of the potter to mold into shape or dash into pieces. The North, judging from its indifference and non-interference, are gradually turning the whole Negro question over to the South to take care of. What will the South do with the Negro, will be the question. Will she educate and elevate him as an intelligent citizen, or degrade him to a serf and slave? She has the power to do either. The unconditional control the victorious North permitted the conquered South to exercise over the colored people since emancipation is one of the things that will perplex the future historian for explanation. The North, with the aid of 200,000 colored soldiers, succeeded in giving the South a severe thrashing. President Lincoln, when he saw the bravery and courage that was displayed by these soldiers on the battlefield, regardless of his previous opinions he may have held on the subject, declared before his God that the 4 millions of slaves in this country should be free. And General Benjamin F. Butler, when he rode over that memorable battlefield and saw the ground covered with brave black soldiers, then and there he resolved before God to these people ever to be true. And he kept his word to the letter, and when he breathed his last at the national capital, his colored friend and faithful servant was the last one to look upon his living countenance. Lincoln and Butler had good reasons for changing their former views relative to the status of the colored people in this country. Their position to the general government and to their former masters should have guaranteed to them better protection. To set them free and leave them without the necessary protection, at the mercy of their former owners, maddened by reason of their defeat, was indeed an oversight. The Southern whites could forgive their Northern brethren for taking up arms against them, but for the colored man and slave who dared to take up arms against the South, there could be no forgiveness. The only thing for them was death. And they have endeavored to make the Negro's freedom taste as bitter to him as the dregs of slavery ever tasted. Charles Sumner, with the insight of a true statesman, anticipated this state of affairs. Realizing as he did that the Negro question was directly or indirectly the source of all the trouble, it was his supreme desire and aim to so fix this question once for all, that, unlike Banquo's ghost, it would never arise to frighten the American people again. He said to the country in acts, if not in words, the only way to settle this question is to change the status of the Negro, make him a man with all the rights of an American citizen, and put in his hands the ballot as a means of his protection. He labored for the realization of this result, but died before its consummation. Among his last words were these: "Do not forget my Civil Rights Bill." The North has forgotten it, and the South has thrown it overboard as a blunder of statesmanship. I shall never forget my interview with Mr. Sumner at the Coolidge House, Boston, on one of my return visits from the South. The object of my visit was to lay before him the condition of my people as I viewed them from personal contact. It was early morning when I called, about the time he was to have his breakfast. As I was ushered into his presence, he remarked that I would have to talk to him while he was eating, for his time was so taken up that he had but few moments to spare. I began by saying that there was never a people in all the history of the world that were placed in a similar position as my people are placed at the present time. I spoke of the madness of the slaveholders as analogous to that of Pharaoh when he was forced to let the people go. But, I continued, the Red Sea separated Pharaoh and his slaves. The freedmen of the South were left with their masters, where there was hate and malice indescribable. The subject of the king departed with gold, silver, and herds of cattle, but the poor emancipated slave had nothing but his empty hands. As I thus began to talk with Senator Sumner, he rested his knife and fork and looked at me with signs of deep sympathy. Said he: "Mr. Randolph, in my feelings and sympathies, I am a colored man, and feel most deeply all the wrongs that your people suffer." He also referred to the trouble he was having with his own party, intimating that it was departing from its true principles and about to leave the colored man out in the cold. Many of us have been taught by experience that Sumner was right, and this will be seen more and more as the years advance. If Sumner was wrong in advocating the ballot for the Negro, Lincoln was wrong in issuing his Emancipation Proclamation. If the proclamation was a military necessity, the ballot was a necessity, for in the absence of military protection, the ballot was the only protector. To condemn one is to condemn the other. Freedom and the right of franchise have come to the colored man through the terrible ordeal of war. The question that is paramount to all questions is, shall the results of the war be recognized? This question the North must ask itself, and put it to the South and demand an answer. Nowhere in our broad land, North or South, are freedom and citizenship accorded to colored people as to others. There are not a few who endeavor to excuse their treatment of the Negro because of his vices. They say he is a thief, unreliable, and immoral. To intimate that all men are thieves and liars because one man is found out to be so, is to manifest one's ignorance of human nature, which is the same in a black man as it is in a white man under similar circumstances. To say that all colored people are dishonest and of a bad character is to be guilty of the same foolishness. On examination it will be found that the honesty and integrity of the colored people will compare favorably with others in the community. Those who are dishonest and immoral are greatly indebted to the institution of slavery for their inheritance. Slavery taught them to steal food by depriving them of sufficient food. It taught them to lie by punishing them severely when detected, and taught them to be immoral by compelling men and women to marry again and again, after their husbands and wives had been sold, that they may raise a new set of children for the slave market. Also by the forced relation of some of the masters and slave drivers, who begot children by slave women, and sold the females at a high price to become mistresses for white men. When our Southern friends speak of the immorality of the colored people, without giving the cause, they should have their fingers guarded upon their lips. Regardless of all these signs of discouragement, there are still signs of encouragement. The progress the colored people have made in face of all difficulties is phenomenal. Since their emancipation, they have increased from 4 millions to 8 millions. Every seat in their schoolhouses is filled, and there is an urgent appeal for more efficient schools. The colored population in the United States pay taxes on $264 million worth of property, and according to Mr. Grady's statement, the colored people in Georgia alone pay taxes on $40 million worth of property, and according to the auditor's last report of Virginia, they pay over $12 million on taxable property. The colored man is not only a plantation hand, but he is a mechanic, tradesman, and banker. He is a preacher, teacher, editor, lawyer, and doctor. The colored people in the States support 7 colleges, 17 academies, and 50 high schools, in which there are 30,000 pupils. They have 1,500,000 children in the common schools, and 24,000 teachers. More than 2,500,000 of the race can read and write. To let the Negro alone, remove all impediments out of his way, and encourage him to make progress along these lines, will solve what appears to many to be a difficult problem. The duty of the colored man for the hour is to prepare himself to be an intelligent and industrious American citizen. The white people of this country and of the world should be patient with the Negro in his progress, for it will be impossible for him to eliminate in one generation the evil effects of 250 years of American slavery. Christian civilization, if it has free course, will adjust difficulties. If this cannot, what will? Will immigration solve the question? No, that will simply throw our duty and responsibility on others. Will extermination satisfy? No, it will add insult to injury, and, like Cain and his brother, will greatly add sorrow to this life and the life to come. There is but one rule, and one only, that can solve the race problem and all difficult problems. That rule came from heaven, through Jesus Christ, and was given to man as his only safe guide. It is called the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. On this rests the joy or sorrow of America. End of chapter 13. Introductory Note, Part 1 and Part 2 of Sketches of Slave Life by Peter Randolph. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introductory Note by Samuel May, Jr. It was on the morning of the 15th of September, 1847, that I learned from a constant and true friend to the slave, Mr. Robert R. Crosby, that a large company of colored people, said to be emancipated slaves from Virginia, were then landing from a schooner at Long Wharf. I immediately went thither and found the report correct. The people in question were in part upon the wharf, and some had not yet left the vessel. I entered into conversation with several of their number, and learned that they had been slaves in Prince George County, Virginia, on the estate of Mr. Carter H. Edloe, on the James River. Mr. Edloe died in 1844, and by will provided for the emancipation of his slaves, and for the payment to each one of $50 whenever they should elect to receive their freedom and go out of the State of Virginia. With a few of his slaves, for a special reason, he had dealt with much more liberally. The provisions of Mr. Edloe's will, it would appear, however, were not carried out in the spirit of the testator, and there is reason to believe that the executor designedly deceived and wronged the slaves. They were kept at work upon the estate as slaves for more than 3 years after their master's death, on the pretence that there was not money sufficient to pay them the sum which the will specified. At the end of that time, in despair of obtaining their rights under the will, the larger part of the people determined to take what they could get, which was less than $15 each, and go to a free state. There were 66 of them, of both sexes and of all ages, from 75 years down to infancy, who decided to go to Boston. Their passage was secured in the schooner Thomas H. Thompson, Wixon, master, by which vessel they arrived in Boston, as stated above. Such was the story told to me, and I may add that further inquiries have entirely satisfied me of its correctness. I found these emancipated people, without exception, desirous of obtaining situations where they might at once go to work, none fearing but that they could support themselves and their families if they could find employment. Of course, I expressed my readiness to aid them in obtaining places if they wished to do so. The offer was gratefully accepted, and without much loss of time, places were found, out of the city, for about one half of them. The remainder found homes and occupation in the city or its immediate vicinity. 8 years have now nearly elapsed, during which time I have observed the course of these emancipated slaves with attention and with some curiosity. I regarded the experiment they were making as an exceedingly interesting one, such an one as, if successful, ought to convince even the most skeptical of the ability of the colored man, even when reared in the ignorance and partial dependence which the condition of slavery imposes, to take care of himself. For this was not a company of slaves selected for any special capacity, or of such as by their own skill and daring had achieved freedom. They were the ordinary working force of one plantation, of all ages and capacities, and in various states of health, and might be presumed to be a fair representation of the average condition, at least, of Virginia slaves. The experiment, if any choose so to regard it, has had a fair trial, and has resulted, I can truly say, very much to their credit. Since the first few months after their arrival, when on account of their destitution and the strangeness of a new home, occasional help was needed by a number of them, the instances in which they have sought charitable aid have been few and infrequent. Even an aged and nearly worn-out man of their number for 6 years maintained himself by his daily labor, and only ceased to attempt it longer when told that he must desist by reason of infirmity of age at upwards of 80 years. Generally, so far as my knowledge extends, they have secured for themselves a sufficient though frugal living, and some of them have decidedly prospered. And in regard to sobriety, honesty, and general good conduct, they will not suffer by comparison with any like number of people in the community. It affords me a sincere pleasure to be able to give this testimony in behalf of these people, our hardly treated brethren. For, unusually fortunate as they were in having a master so eccentric as to believe that his slaves desired liberty and were entitled to it, yet their lot in slavery left, as it ever must, on body and mind indelible marks of its blighting power. When all the untoward, disheartening, soul-crushing influences of their former life are considered, it seems to me not less surprising than it is honorable to themselves that they have used their liberty so justly and so well. I think it well to subjoin their names and ages from a list taken by me at the time of their arrival. Some of them have gone where the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary are at rest. Lucy Fountain, 76. Charles Fountain, about 40. William Fountain, about 40. Carter Selden, 47. Wife and 6 children. Levi Scott, about 75. Daniel . Peter Randolph, 27. Wife and child. Anthony Randolph, 24, Richard Randolph, 22, James Randolph, 10, Wyatt Lee, 25, wife and 2 children, Frank Churchwell, 54, Adam Harrison, 55, George Mayerson, 45, wife and 2 children, Bury Robeson, wife and 2 children. Davy Mead, 45. Patty Mead, his wife. Torrington Ruffin, 36, wife and 4 children. William Archie, 32, wife and 5 children. Davy Jones, 40. Andrew Clark, 23, wife and child. Henry Carter and wife. Amy Richardson, 29, 2 children. Judy Griffin, 26, 2 children. Fanny Bailey, 30. Sam Jones, 24. Richard Whiting. Jack Harrison, 29. Ralph Webb, 24. Peter Taylor, 36. The unpretending work, written by one of the above 66, is commended to the public as wholly trustworthy and deserving of their favor. Samuel May, Jr. Chapter I. The System. The good anti-slavery men have very much to contend with in their exertions for the cause of freedom. Many people will not believe their statements, call them unreasonable and fanatical. Some call them ignorant deceivers, who have never been out of their own home, and yet pretend to a knowledge of what is going on 1,000 miles from them. Many call them dangerous members of society, sowing discord and distrust where there should be naught but peace and brotherly love. My readers, give attention to the simple words of one who knows what he utters is true, who is no stranger to the beauties of slavery or the generosity of the slaveholder. Spend a few moments in reading his statement in regard to the system of American slavery. Do not scoff or doubt. He writes what he does know, what he has seen and experienced, for he has been for 27 years of his life a slave, and he here solemnly pledges himself to truth. Not once has he exaggerated, for he could not. The half of the woes and horrors of slavery his feeble pen could not portray. This system is one of robbery and cruel wrong from beginning to end. It robs men and women of their liberty, lives, property, affections, and virtue, as the following pages will show. It is not only a source of misery to those in bonds, but those who fasten the chains are made wretched by it, for a state of war constantly exists between the master and servant. The one would enforce obedience to his every wish, however wrong and unjust. He would exact all the earnings of the slave to the uttermost farthing. The latter feels the restraint and writhes under it. He sees the injustice, and at times attempts to assert his rights, but he must submit either to the command or the lash. Obey implicitly he must. The argument so often brought forward, that it would be for the interest of the owner to treat his slaves well, and of course he would not injure his own interests, may do for some, but not for the thinking and considerate. When does the angry tyrant reflect upon what, in the end, will be the best for him? To gratify his passion for the moment, to wreak out his revenge upon a helpless menial, is, at the time of excitement, his interest, and he will serve it well. Many argue that the Southern masters are not to blame for this wrong. They inherited it from their fathers, it is said, and what can they do? Get rid of it. Would it be sensible to suppose that generation after generation were justifiable in becoming drunkards because some ancestor had been? Certainly not. Any person who reasons thus would be considered insane. If my father stole or murdered, would that excuse me for committing the same crimes? No, we all know better than that. Again, it is said, the slaveholder has bought them and paid his money for them. Perhaps his whole property is in them. Should he give them up and beggar himself? If his property consists in human beings, surely he should give it up, though he starved in consequence. Of whom has he bought them? Who can own humanity but the great Creator? As the good Vermont judge said, "Show a bill of sale from the Almighty, and we acknowledge your claim." Some will say, the slaveholder cannot live without the negro. The climate will not permit the white man to toil there. Very well, admit it. Then let him grant to men their rights, make them free citizens, pay them justly for their honest toil, and see the consequences. All would be happier and better. Slavery enriches not the mind, heart, or soil where it abides. It curses and blights everything it comes in contact with. Away, away with! Tear up by the roots these noxious weeds, which choke the growth of all fair plants, and sow in their stead the beauteous flowers of freedom, well watered by the pure waters of religion, and what a rich harvest will be yours." Chapter 2. Slaves on the Plantation. The slave goes to his work when he sees the daybreak in the morning, and works until dark at night. The slaves have their food carried to them in the field. They have 1/2 hour to eat it in the winter, and 1 hour in the summer. Their time for eating is about 8 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. Sometimes they have not so much time given to them. The overseer stands by them until they have eaten, and then he orders them to work. The slaves return to their huts at night, make their little fires, and lie down until they are awakened for another day of toil. No beds are given them to sleep on. If they have any, they find them themselves. The women and men all have to work on the farms together. They must fare alike in slavery. Husbands and wives must see all that happens to each other, and witness the sufferings of each. They must see their children polluted, without the power to prevent it. How the slaves contrive to get food. There are some animals in Virginia called raccoons, possums, old hares, and squirrels. The best of these is the possum, which lives in old trees and in the earth. The slave sets his trap in the swamps where the possum usually lives. The traps are made by cutting down trees and cutting them in short pieces about 5 feet long. Then they raise the log on 3 pieces of stick, like the figure 4. These traps are made on the Sabbath. One slave will sometimes have 15 or 20 of them, and will go at night with his torch of pitch pine and see if his traps have caught anything for him to eat. Sometimes he finds a possum and a raccoon, and sometimes a squirrel and old hare. This old hare is something like a rabbit. All of these animals are good food for the poor slave, and make him feel very glad that he has them to eat. Some of the slaves hunt these animals with dogs, trained for the purpose. They run them up the trees in the forest, where, as they are a harmless animal, they can be taken very easily. They do not fight very hard when caught, but are very easily overcome. But they are a deceitful little animal. They will lie on the ground and make you think they are dead, but if you leave them they will creep off so soon that you cannot conceive how the little animal got away so cute. The only way they can be kept safely is to be put in a bag, or in a basket with a cover. The slave knows best when to hunt these creatures. The best time is just at the rise of the tide in the rivers. There is another method that the slave takes to get his food. He makes what is called a fish trap. This is made by cutting white oak wood into very small strips, which are tied together with a great deal of ingenuity. This trap is set in the very deep water, and attended by the slaves at night and on the Sabbath, this being all the time they have to attend to their traps. And very glad are they of this opportunity of getting some nice fish. Oftentimes the overseer will take what he wants for his own use, and the slaves must submit. There are some little fruits in Virginia that are called simmons. They grow very plentifully, and are sweet and good. The slaves get them in the fall of the year. Then they get a barrel, and put the simmons into it, and put water there too, and something else that grows on trees that they call locusts, which are about 10 inches long and 2 across. They put the locusts and simmons into the water together, and let them stand for 2 or 3 days. Then the water is drained off, and the leaves are used as you would use coffee. The slaves put this liquid in gourds, and carry it to the field with them, and drink out of their gourds while they eat their bread. House slaves. When the slave master owns a great many slaves, 10 or a dozen are always employed to wait on himself and family. They are not treated so cruelly as the field slaves. They are better fed and wear better clothing, because the master and his family always expect to have strangers visit them, and they want their servants to look well. These slaves eat from their master's table, wear broadcloth and calico. They wear ruffled bosomed shirts, too, such as Dr. Nehemiah Adams declares he saw while on his visit to the South, where he became so much in love with the peculiar institution. These slaves, although dressed and fed better than others, have to suffer alike with those whose outward condition is worse. They are much to be compared to galvanized watches, which shine and resemble gold, but are far from being the true metal. So with these slaves who wait upon their masters at table. Their broadcloth and calico look fine, but you may examine their persons, and find many a lash upon their flesh. They are sure of their whippings, and are sold the same as others. Sometimes their masters change, and put them on the farm, that the overseers may whip them. Among those who wait upon the master there is always one to watch the others, and report them to him. This slave is treated as well as his master, because it is for the master's interest that he does this. This slave he always carries with him when he visits the North, particularly such slaves as cannot be made to leave their master, because they are their master's watchdog at home. So master can trust them. Before leaving, master always talks very kindly to them, and promises something very great for a present, if they are true to him until his return. These slaves know what they must say when asked as to their treatment at home, and of the treatment of their fellows. They leave their wives, their mothers, brothers and sisters and children, toiling and being driven and whipped by the overseer, and tortured and insulted on every occasion. Deception of the slaveholder. All the slaves, as well as their owners, are addicted to drinking. So when the slaveholder wants to make a show of his niggers, as he calls them, he gives them rum to drink. When the master knows a northern man is to visit him, he gives orders to the overseer, and the overseer orders every slave to dress himself and appear on the field. If the slaves have any best, they must put it on. Perhaps a man has worked hard, extra times all the year, and got his wife a 4-penny gown. She must put it on, and go to the field to work. About the time the stranger is expected, a jug of rum is sent to the field, and every slave has just enough given him to make him act as if he was crazy. When such a stranger as Rev. Dr. Adams appears with the master, he does not see the negroes, but the rum that is in them, and when he hears their hurrah, and sees their Jim Crow actions, he takes it for granted that they are as happy as need be, and their condition could not be bettered. The owner gives the visitor liberty to ask his niggers questions. He will ask them if they love their master, or wish to leave him. Poor slave will say he would not leave his master for the world. But, oh, my reader, just let the poor slave get off, and he would be in Canada very soon, where the slaveholder dare not venture. The slaves do not speak for themselves. The slave-holding master and his rum are working in their heads, speaking for slavery, and this is the way the slaveholder deceives his friend from the North. Flogging. For whipping the slaves in Virginia there are no rules. The slave receives from the slaveholder from 50 to 500 lashes. The slave owner would think 50 stripes an insult to the slave. If the slave is let off with 50 lashes, he must show a very good temper. Men, women, and children must be whipped alike on their bare backs, it being considered an honor to whip them over their clothes. The slaves are placed in a certain position when they are flogged, with sufficient management to hold them very still, so they cannot work their hands or feet while they are wooding them up, as they call it in Virginia. Some of the slaves have to lie down on their stomachs, flat on the ground, and be stretched out so as to keep their skin tight for the lash, and thus lie until they receive as much as they choose to put on. If they move, they must receive so many lashes extra. When the slaveholder expects to give his slave 500 lashes, he gives him about half at a time. Then he washes him down with salt and water, and gives him the remainder of what he is to have. At such times the slave owner has his different liquors to drink, while he is engaged in draining the blood of the slave. So he continues to drink his rum and whip his victim. When he does not flog his victims on the ground, they are tied by their hands and swung up to a great tree, just so the ends of their toes may touch the ground. In this way they receive what number of lashes they are destined to. The master has straw brought that the blood may not touch his shoes. Ah, reader, this is true, every word of it. The poor slave is whipped till the blood runs down to the earth, and then he must work all day, cold or hot, from week's end to week's end. There are hundreds of slaves who change their skins nearly as often as they have a new suit of clothes. End of introductory note and parts 1 and 2. Sketches of Slave Life by Peter Randolph, Chapter 3. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Farms adjoining Edloe's Plantation. I will give my readers a little knowledge concerning the neighbors of my owner, that they may be able to judge of slavery by something more than the character of one slaveholder or his management among his slaves. Edloe's farm was what was called Upper Brandon on James River. It consisted of about 56 square miles, and was worked by 81 slaves. William B. Harrison owned Middle Brandon. His farm was about 100 square miles. He owned over 200 slaves. Of their treatment I shall speak, and also of the numerous overseers he had employed. George B. Harrison, the owner of my father, owned Lower Brandon. His farm was the same in size as his brother's, and he owned the same number of slaves. William B. Harrison fed his slaves what is called regular in Virginia. He was one of the best feeders on James River. He clothed them well, too. But he was a great flogger, and probably the greatest in the region. In his dealings with those who were not slaves, he was upright, never deceiving, but always doing as he agreed. If any other case than slavery came before him, he would make a liberal decision in favor of right. But he would have his slaves whipped whenever the overseer wished it. Sometimes he would go to church and preach to his slaves. I have heard him myself, but, my readers, it did seem like mocking God for such as he to stand up and preach. The first overseer of Mr. Harrison's that I knew was Benjamin Bishop. Under his reign many of the slaves went into the presence of their God, to show the bloody stripes of the lash received from Benjamin Bishop. Harrison did not care for his slaves as the man who owned me did, but left them to the mercy of the overseers. Go to the South, reader. There you will see many mulattoes, the descendants of Benjamin Bishop. He continued with Harrison several years, when, being sent down to Richmond to sell some negroes, he made $100 more than he was to pay his employer. Therefore he concluded to take the business of human traffic into his own hands, and became a nigger trader. He was not very successful in his undertaking, being too fond of what is called toddy in the Southern States. He became a great drunkard and a great gambler, vices intimately connected with the peculiar institution, and was obliged to give up his business. He was afterward employed by Edloe, my master, but he did not live with him long before he was discharged for his unmerciful treatment of the blacks. Death called to him soon, and he was ushered into the awful presence of the righteous Judge, who listens to the cries of the poor widows and the orphans, with his guilty hands dripping with the blood of his fellow creatures, who had sunk groaning to the earth beneath his barbed heel of cruel oppression. The next man who took charge of this farm was John Q. Adams. This man, notwithstanding his noble name, was a disgrace to civilization. For when he had beaten his victims till their bodies could bear no more, he would lash the bottoms of their feet. My readers, this may seem incredible, but it is truth. Harrison's slaves trembled at the very mention of his name, and the sight of him would bring woe and terror to their very souls. The poor creatures would wish that the earth would open and swallow them, that they might never look upon the face of Adams again, or hear the sound of his voice. His voice had all the fearful sound of the roaring lion and the hideous howl of the prowling wolf. I verily believe his organs of speech were made of the hardest granite, fastened together with monstrous iron bolts. As his victims were dripping with their own blood, he would bellow forth his curses, and dare them to call on God for help. Groanings and sorrow, pains and misery untold, unspeakable, were the portion of the negroes upon Harrison's plantation. Adams practiced everything that was mean, cruel, devilish, everything that could be thought of by demons. This conduct continued 11 years before I left Virginia in 1847. I could give a great many more truths concerning this J. Q. Adams that may seem too outrageous for a human being to conceive. I would not do injustice to any one, not even a slave driver, for I know I must stand at the bar of the Eternal, and render an account of every word spoken in the flesh. I know that, in order to do good, my testimony must be the truth." The next overseer was Hardin Harrison. He owned 3 slaves himself, but was very religious and belonged to the Presbyterian Church. He did not beat so much as Adams, but was very strict with the slaves. He used to say his prayers every night, and grace before his meals. Sometimes his grace failed him, and then the poor slave must expect something more than soft words or gentle treatment. He never yet had grace sufficient to excuse any little fault in a negro. He used to quote Moses' law to whip by. His face was very narrow and hypocritical. He had just enough of professed religion to deceive. He was one of those calculated to deceive Northern visitors, who saw him go on with his solemn ceremonies of religion to make them believe that good and religious men guided the poor ignorant blacks, and kept them from sinking entirely into the blackness of heathenism. Then Mr. Harrison would take just enough of his toddy to make him feel as good as anybody else. He lived with Mr. W. B. Harrison as long as he wished, then left and went home to his own farm. The next overseer was named Edloe. He used to call himself the Snapping Turtle, and would rawhide the slaves so they would be obliged to wind cotton around their persons to protect their wounds from their clothing. Of other things of which he was guilty, delicacy forbids me to speak. Judge for yourselves. He continued there 3 years, and was at it when I left Virginia. One more of these men I have not mentioned, whose name was Ladd. It should have been Hornet. I cannot speak of the actions of this man without a shrinking from the fact that I ever knew such a being. He made men and women to growl and bark like dogs. At all hours of the night you might find Ladd in the woods with his dogs, prowling about after some skulking fugitive, and all day driving and whipping the persecuted victims till they were almost driven to self-murder, which nothing but the belief that those who take their own lives cannot be happy in another world kept them from. The slaves used to run away to Edloe and get him to go and beg mercy for them, and he would do so. For 2 years Ladd managed in this way. Then the great Judge called him from earth to give an account of his bloody deeds. Some of my readers may ask why we were always afflicted with such horrid men as overseers in our region, and if there were no good ones. Ah, dear reader, do you think a good man would take such a position? And what man is there who would not become worse daily by being placed in such a situation, with unlimited power over hundreds of abject beings whom he looks upon as only a little above the brute? Ah, ye who look coolly on in the distance, and doubt the existence of all this wretchedness, go nearer, become yourself the property of another, and then your doubts will be removed. The first overseer I knew of on George Harrison's plantation was Charles Charbour. Devilish is the only word which will describe his character. My father was a colored driver under him, and he was made to beat his fellow slaves most unmercifully, and there was no escape unless he would have submitted to a worse fate, if possible, for himself. Charbour has been known to cut the skin with a knife from the poor black men's feet, that he might not run away, or that the saying, "I will cut off every inch of your black hide," might be literally fulfilled. Truly he was one toward whom the blood of the slave will cry whenever he approaches those fields of labor, or wanders by the swamps or by the riverside. There was no peace for man, woman, or child wherever he followed. Harrison, who owned the slaves, was a young man at this time, and cared for nothing, so Charbour had everything his own way. God in his mercy visited this farm with a great calamity. The cholera came among the slaves and carried many to their rest. The very atmosphere at this time seemed to burn with evil and wrong for the poor negroes, so that death was their best friend. Many of my father's relations were owned here, and well we knew of the sufferings which their owner allowed, and sought no means to alleviate. Harrison's conduct at last made him an object of scorn and indignation to most of the people who knew him. One day he was on business at the court-house, and while he was seated among many gentlemen who were strangers to him, they commenced a conversation about young Harrison and his abominable course in regard to his people. Very freely they discussed his character, and he had the benefit of their opinion from their own mouths. He went home rather humbled, and commenced the work of reformation on his plantation. Charbour was forbidden to whip so much, and the slaves were really treated better. That season was to the slaves what the conversion of Paul was to the church he had persecuted. There was rest for a little season. Shortly after this sudden change in George Harrison, he died, when the clouds of darkness again fell upon those poor negroes. His brother became the guardian of the estate, and everything was left in the hands of the overseers, who used their powers as bad men might be expected to. Another neighbor of ours, or rather of my master's, was his brother. His plantation was called Willow Hill, and was very large. This Mr. Edloe owned 2 farms, one in Cumberland County, and a great many slaves. Many of these slaves were related to me, and those of my fellows who came north with me. William Allen owned a large farm across from Lower Brandon in Surrey County, called Claremont. He also owned 12 other farms, and 999 slaves. He was uncle to Edloe, my owner, and was considered the richest man in Virginia, except old Bob Balling of Petersburg. He was not a good man. He was possessed of none of the virtues, but some of the vices of King Solomon. He was very fond of the young females, yet he was married to no one. He was very cruel to his people, and used what is called the bell and horns on his slaves, to keep them from running away. He used to chain them together with a long chain, with heavy fastenings at the end of the chain. The bell and horns were a harness made so as to fasten on the slave's neck, with a band of iron that would go round the neck, to which was attached another band that passed over the top of the head about 3 feet perpendicular, then turned with a hook so as to hook over the limbs of trees, if the slave should attempt running in the swamps out of sight of the overseer. He always kept a good stock of them on hand, to use as you would use bells for cows, that you might find them easily if they strayed. Some of his slaves were put to death by his overseers, but he did not trouble himself about it. He had plenty more. Ah, my readers, more blood has been drawn from Allen's slaves than he would be willing to carry upon his shoulders for one moment. He was very close with his slaves with regard to food and clothes, and those who lived along the rivers used to catch fish at stolen moments, so as to keep themselves along from time to time until Allen died. When that occurred, Edloe immediately went over and freed all the poor creatures from their harnesses, leg irons, and handcuffs. Allen had freed his colored sons and about 8 others. The rest of his slaves he gave to one of his nephews named William Allen. He gave one of his farms to be divided among all his relations. Edloe was one, and he drew 18 of those slaves, who were all freed with myself. The rest went to drudge with their new masters under a bondage worse than Egyptian. Cabin Point. There was but one village near Brandon where the large farms were cultivated, and that was in Surrey County, about 7 miles from Lower Brandon. This village was called Cabin Point, and there the United States mail stopped. 5 or 6 stores were kept there, and it was a great place for loafers, for at these stores you could buy almost everything, especially rum and other liquors. Saturdays and Sundays all the lower classes of whites and free colored people used to assemble there to drink and gamble. No slaves were allowed there, unless sent by their masters with a pass. Cabin Point was famous for its fighting, drunkenness, and every kind of degradation. The whites beat the free colored people there, and they dare not raise their hands lest they should be mobbed. Females were not safe there an instant. Nothing could protect them from the violence of those drunken desperadoes. If any good man from the North should witness one of these scenes, he would think it indicative of anything but civilization. This place was the rendezvous for all the rowdies of Prince George and Surrey counties. There the overseers would meet for their drunken revels, and return to the farms to make the backs of the outraged negroes pay the bills for their debauchery. There were many wealthy men there, who owned many human beings. The most prominent among them were Mr. Peters, A. Sledge, Dr. Strong, and Dr. Graves. Dr. Graves was so cruel and wicked, he would not take time even to whip his slaves, but would use his knife on them. He would chain them on their backs, and give them nothing to eat for 2 or 3 days at a time. He was called the best physician in the place, but he was as good a devil as I could wish to see. He was employed by all the large farmers to attend their slaves in sickness, and was very fond of the female slaves, to whom he was a good doctor. I will not spend time to write more of him. He was so wicked, my feelings become excited, and language fails me in speaking of him. Dr. Strong was a mild man, as fine a man as I ever knew among slaveholders. He was not cruel. He looked upon his negroes as human beings, possessed of feelings, and as capable of enjoyment and suffering as himself, and he treated them kindly. He appeared to be a Christian, but still he held his fellow men in bondage. He did not allow them to act for themselves and work for themselves. Even kind-hearted Dr. Strong could not live out the precepts of Jesus and remain a slaveholder. He was succeeded by Dr. Gray, who, though a very strict man among his people, was not cruel. Mr. Peters was not as bad as many other slaveholders, though he used to whip his slaves to keep them tame, for fear they would run wild. Mr. Peters was a mild whipping slaveholder, died a slaveholder, and will receive a slaveholder's reward. Amos Sledge was very cruel and inhuman in the treatment of his people. He worked them very hard, fed them very poorly, clothed them but scantily, whipped them unmercifully, and allowed them no privileges. They were a downcast, heartbroken set of people. End of Chapter 3.